Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first in a series of educational seminars offered by Greenfield Tree Committee. The focus is on tree nursery growing practices. And this series is funded by DCR. It's a community forestry challenge grant that is paying for this series. Tonight we're joined by Dan Ziomek. Many of you know him from his work in area nurseries. He was a nursery manager at Hadley Garden Center for over 30 years and is now at Sugarloaf Nurseries. He has a degree in plant and soil science from UMass, and some of you might also know him as the voice of Bird Songs. It's a local radio program that's been going on for over 10 years. Joining us tonight are primarily members of Greenfield Tree Committee and a guest from GCC. So I think without further ado, I will turn it over to Dan, who will be covering a number of tree growing practices.
Thank you, Mary. I'll add a few things there. I did go to Cobbleskill out in New York State for nursery management, so I do have some nursery management background as well. I had my own nursery for about 10 or 12 years prior to having children. My wife told me we couldn't have kids in a nursery because the nursery took so much of my time. So not to mention my tax brother kept telling me, as long as you keep losing money, you'll never have to pay taxes. So anyway, so I do have some growing background as well. It's not all retail. And it was 32 years at Hadley Garden Center and now 3 at Sugarloaf and counting. And we're looking forward to that getting better and better each year. We're going to talk about a variety of topics tonight, tree irrigation to start with, and then we'll go into soils, and then fertilizer, and we'll end up with weed control, both in containers and on the ground. And feel free to ask questions anytime they come up. But we'll start with irrigation, and a lot of these notes I made prior to taking a tour of the nursery with Mary and Richard, and some of them are now moot, but I might still mention them anyway. So the first thing, was, what type of irrigation do you have? Do you have drip or overhead? And obviously you have drip irrigation out at the nursery. I didn't know that when I made my notes. Drip irrigation is definitely the way to go. You don't have the evaporation that you get from overhead irrigation. You have a lot fewer disease issues with drip irrigation as well. Because the water is being put directly on the roots rather than on the foliage. So I was happy to see that you have drip irrigation. I don't know when you're watering, but morning is definitely the preferred time to water. That's because, again, evaporation is not happening as quickly in the morning as it is in the heat of the day. So if we can water in the morning, the plant will take that in and be able to thrive, not survive, thrive throughout the day because its root system will be full of moisture. So again, I don't know what time of day you're watering, but morning would definitely be the best. And then just running the irrigation for long periods of time when you do run it, rather than quick bursts of water like a lot of turf irrigation gets done. A lot of home irrigation systems are set to run 15, 20, 30 minutes at the most, which is fine for turf because the roots are all near the surface. But when we're talking about a shade tree, a lot of those roots are much deeper in the container. So you need to run the irrigation longer, but maybe less often so that we get those roots to hunt out the water that we're providing. So again, I don't know how often the system is running. Mary or Richard may be able to help with that. But long soakings, maybe skipping a day in between, is going to be more beneficial to the plant material. Also, when temperatures go up, we're going to have to increase the length of time we're watering. So as we get into July, August, when we hit those 90-degree days, we should be watering for even longer than we do in April or May. So that's something to keep in mind going forward. And then species dependence. I looked around a little bit at what you have growing out there. Let's just take a, for instance, you've got some amelanchier out there. That's a plant that grows on the edge of beaver ponds, likes some extra moisture, maybe going forward you bunch together the plants like swamp white oaks and amelanchier, and if you had any river birch, I'd throw that into the mix. Those plants that are higher water users, you bunch those together, and if it's possible, run the irrigation on those more often than some of the plants that don't need it so much. Elms need a fair bit of water, as do red maples. But I'm sure like Tilia doesn't need as much water, and there's some other species out there that don't need as much water, but you could do the research on that. Just to cut down on how much water you're giving in general, and give the ones that need it more what they would appreciate. And then, when it comes to watering, if we give the plants too little, we're going to stress them out, and we're not going to get the growth that we want. But on the other hand, if we give them too much, we're going to end up with pest and disease issues, and also leach out our fertilizer that we're applying. So we want to make sure we're checking how much water we're giving each plant. So that brings up leaching fractions, and I don't know if you've ever checked how much your irrigation system is putting out, but it would be good to stick one of those drip tubes that you have set up out there in a pail, and first of all check and see how much you're putting out in a normal run time of, let's say, half an hour. How many gallons is each tree getting? I don't know if you've done that. And then the leaching fractions, you divide the amount of leached water by the amount you applied. So you would need to know how much you're applying each time you run the system, and then have a tray underneath to catch how much is leaching out. But you're looking for about 15% when you do that fraction there, which is what most trees will thrive on. And of course, the inch of water per week is always a good baseline to go to.
So Dan, can I interrupt?
Yep.
When you talk about 15%, is that 15% that's leaching out?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And now a lot of that has to do with the soil type, temperatures, the grow bags, all different factors play into how much is going to leach out.
And I can tell you currently, I might need Richard's help a little bit, but we are watering every 3 days, and the irrigation is on for, I think it runs for 3 hours. And each of the trees has one of the, you saw the little tubes, they each have 3 holes, in each loop. And Richard, can you remember when we did a test, the pail test, how much it was?
I recall that it was at least, say, 3 gallons. It filled the pail, one of those 5-gallon
Yeah.
jugs.
Well, that's where the leach test might come in, because if you're running it for 3 hours at a time, just to give you an idea, the maximum we run our drip at the nursery, and we have our trees mulched in as well, is about 45 minutes. Okay. So 3 hours is an awful long time to be running it. You might be finding that you have more water running out, because I'm sure you're not standing there watching it for 3 hours, than you're actually getting to the trees. Mm-hmm. So that would be worth checking.
Okay, thank you.
Going forward.
Is the 45 minutes per, I forgot what you said, but is the 45 minutes for trees you're trying to establish, or is it for like all of them overall?
So what I was talking about was at our nursery in Sunderland, our trees are above ground. They are chipped in, so that helps to hold some moisture around them, and we'll talk about that later. But we're running the irrigation for 45 minutes at night, which isn't the best, but that's when we can run it because our overhead irrigation needs to run when there's no customers there. And 45 minutes gives us a good soaking. Each one of our bald and burlap trees has one tube on it, usually wrapped around at least one time. Any other questions on irrigation?
Is there a quick way to sort of tell if the tree is getting too much or not enough water just by looking at?
Not enough is very easy. You're going to see wilting right away. In the heat of summer, you might see some leaf drop due to stress if it's not getting enough water. But on the other hand, you can see leaf drop when the plant is stressed from overwatering as well. So that's a fine line there. But the plant will usually let you know. Like I say, you'll see drooping is the first sign. And certain species are going to droop faster, like elms will droop quickly. I mentioned birches, they droop very quickly. Red maples will droop fairly quickly as well. So those would be the ones I'm keying in during those hot months, keying in on those species to be able to see whether we're getting enough water or not.
I wonder if you could say a little more about the leach test. Do you want some leaching just to be sure that you're getting water all the way through the pot?
You're always going to get some leaching. There's no way around it. But what you're looking for is that 15% of the total volume of water that you put on, would be, where you want to be when it comes to leaching. And to get to that, you adjust the time of run. You might adjust your soils in the long run. So there are lots of different ways. But you're always going to have some leaching. There's no way around that. It's worse in a hard plastic container than it is in a grow bag, I must say, because a lot of times the water will follow the sides of the container right down and run right out the bottom without ever touching the root system. So that's why the grow bags are a good way to go.
I'm just wondering, Dan, I was thinking about what you said about different trees needing different amounts of water, and would you, given the size of our nursery, would you approach it by perhaps having, so we're on timers right now, maybe having 2 different zones, or would you just add, in the loops that are in the pots, add an extra hole so everything's still on the same time, but some of them are getting more because there's more holes in the loops?
So I would leave that up to you. I wouldn't mess with the holes because that can affect your flow rates to all the trees. So I would leave the holes the way they are. I think the best way would be to have a different zone if you can do that, or the way you have it separated there, maybe it just requires moving some trees around so that the front half that might flood on a heavy rain day, that's where your wetland trees are, we'll call them, and your dryland trees are at the far end of the nursery, and you can that would be your 2 zones.
Uh-huh. So instead of asking DPW to fix the flooding problem we have, just to take advantage of it.
Well, yeah, or live with it,
yeah.
Because you know how fast DPW works. Just live with it, but plan for the flood by putting species that can take it there.
Yeah, it's a pretty challenging situation there, just with the lay of the land and the compaction and everything. I don't think there is an easy fix for the flooding. So
no,
yeah.
So that's why I say you live with it and work with it, and put the species there that can take it.
So if it rains hard on a day, you just skip watering that day.
That's correct, if you have the ability to do that. I mean, nobody lives right there, so it's not like you're going to run out there and turn the irrigation off. At our nursery, if we see in the forecast we're going to have 3 or 4 days of rain, we can shut our system down. You can probably do the same thing. But if it's going to be one rainstorm on one night, we're not going to mess with the system for that one night. If we know 2 inches of rain is coming, the system's still running. We know it's going to dry out going forward.
I will say that my partner Glenn, who set up the irrigation system, would love to have an excuse to buy a more elaborate system with Bluetooth capability so that he could manage it from home.
Well, being that our nursery is owned by Snows, we do have that capability. They can change everything from their cell phones or a laptop up in Greenfield. All I have to do is text or make a phone call, and they just change it. They change the runtime. They can change the days of the week. They don't have to come down there and change anything. So it's not that far-fetched to get to that point. Expensive, though. Anything else on irrigation? Sorry, put my mic down. All right, let's move on to growing media. And again, I made these notes before touring the nursery. So the main functions of our growing media, no matter where it comes from or what you use, is it supplies the roots with nutrients, air, and water, allows for maximum root growth, and physical support, meaning it keeps the plants from tipping over. Now, there are lots of growing medias on the market. Most of them have a good component of bark, well-aged bark, which you are using currently. A lot of them will use peat moss as the other main ingredient. Now, peat bogs and peat moss are on the blacklist right now because of the degradation of peat bogs up in Canada. But you're using compost, which is great. And the one problem I saw, and again we'll get to this later on, is that your compost pile is exposed to weed seeds. So we're fighting weeds in the containers now, but our compost pile is there collecting lots of weed seeds. So that would be something to address going forward, but we'll get to that in the weed part. When it comes to soil media, drainage is crucial. It prevents root rot on a lot of different species. Now, it's less of a problem on shade trees, but you can get root rot in cercis, redbud. If you were to grow any dogwoods, you can run into root rot problems on dogwoods. Again, less of a problem in shade trees, but it is something to keep in mind. That's why we put a heavy dose of the well-aged bark in there. The organic matter that we add, whether it's compost or peat moss or what have you, it improves the nutrient content and the soil structure, keeping those air spaces open, because we don't want to end up with a waterlogged condition. No plant wants to grow in waterlogged conditions, so that's why it's important that we have plenty of air spaces in there. And then you can also add inorganic materials like perlite and vermiculite to help with aeration and drainage. I know that's not something you're currently doing, but if you were ever to move on to bag soils of some type, you're going to find at least a small percentage of either perlite or vermiculite. Both of these things come from volcanic sources, so they are organic, but they're inert. There's no nutrient value to them or anything like that. They're really just there to add pore spaces, and fertilizers will bind to them and be slowly released to the plant as well. So, and again, I made these notes prior to seeing the nursery, but I was just going through some of the additions they make to these commercial growing mixes. Peat moss aids with water retention. If you've ever gotten a wet bale of peat moss, you know how heavy it is. It will hold nutrients as well. It's slow to dry out, however, and again, that's why they add the bark to it, so you have aeration along with water holding at the same time. But as I said, peat bogs are being over-harvested, so that's why people are shying away from peat moss. The processed bark aids with porosity, again, air spaces, bulk density, which is going to hold our plant upright. It doesn't hold nutrients. That's one bad thing. And it's high in carbon. So what happens when we have a high carbon source in our soil mix? Any microorganisms that we have in the container are going to go to that carbon source and want to break it down. And they need nutrients to feed themselves. So they will actually take fertilizer that we're feeding the tree with and use it to fuel their own bodies to break down those bark mulch or bark chips. So that's why we want to make sure we're using well-aged bark chips, not fresh from the chipper bark chips. Perlite, as I said, naturally occurring volcanic glass product, helps with aeration and can hold water in its pores, so not a bad product. Vermiculite, another naturally occurring mica-like material, helps with water retention as well as some nutrient retention. And then there's other things you can add to your soil mix. You can add sand. You have to be careful with sand because it's hard to mix in. It wants to because it's a dense, heavy product, it wants to go to the bottom of the container, and you end up with a sand layer on the bottom. Roots don't like to go into sand very much. So it's really hard to mix in sand well unless you use like an old concrete mixer or something like that. You can mix in coconut coir, which is expensive but has the same properties as your bark you're currently using. Lime to balance the pH, buffer the pH, would not be a bad idea. I don't know that you know the pH of your compost. Bark is generally acidic, but it would be worth getting a pH test done on your compost to see where you're at. Or maybe, who do you get it from?
We get it from Adams.
Yeah, Adams?
Martin's, sorry.
Yeah, Martin's Farm might know the pH of their compost, but it'd be worth checking anyway. Mycorrhizae might be something to add as well. These are little microorganisms that will attach themselves to the root system. You may know about them, may have read about them, and they will aid in nutrient and water uptake. Pines and things like that are famous for having large mycorrhizae bodies attached to them, but lots of shade trees will do it as well. And then, I know now that you are limited on what you can use for chemicals, but a biofungicide of some type might not be a bad thing to add into your soil mix as well to prevent, again, root diseases that can occur. We're seeing some new disease organisms come down the pike. There's one out on the West Coast right now. It's a new type of sudden oak disease that came over from China. And therefore, we may see some restrictions due to that new disease out on the West Coast. So just something to be thinking about. Any questions on soil media, growing media? Good.
Yeah, Dan, you talked about coconut, and I've never used it, but I've read that it's interchangeable with peat moss, or is that, and is there a way to I've heard that peat moss is more expensive. Is there a way does anyone source coconut to use instead of peat moss?
100%. You can buy a ready-made mix that's primarily coconut coir, and a lot of this happened when the marijuana growing industry really hit the ground running. That's when coconut coir really came on the scene because they like that for growing marijuana. Don't ask me why. I don't know the reasons. But it is interchangeable with peat moss. You can get it from Griffin Greenhouse Supply, lots of different suppliers of that product.
So if you have a species that you're trying to build a mycorrhizal network with, but it's also vulnerable to fungal disease, how do you balance that in terms of fungicide application?
Well, mycorrhizae theoretically won't be killed by an organic fungicide or biofungicide. It's designed to go in and attack bad fungus, not the good ones. And mycorrhizae are resistant to the biofungicide.
Back to the coconut coir. We use those top, I don't know what they call them, Mary, but cocoa mats. Is that the same stuff?
That is the same stuff. It's just been formed into a disc to help with weed prevention, which we'll, again, talk about down the road. It is the exact same stuff, just formulated differently. When you see coconut coir come out of the bag, let's say, it's very stringy, but it can come in different forms. They break it up more if you're using it in a soil mix than if you just buy coconut coir. I know we used to sell bricks of coconut coir at Hadley Garden Center. So,
is there some way to break up the top things that we get so that we can reuse them in the soil?
Yeah, you could do that. I don't know how much you would actually get from that because those things aren't very big. But you could throw them through some kind of backyard grinder and just kind of break them down that way.
If we have one.
So Dan, right now we're using about, I think it's 3 parts bark mulch and 1 part compost. Is there any reason for us to make a change to that at this point?
Well, when we were out at the nursery, you mentioned things blowing over all the time. I could see going to a slightly heavier compost mix,
Okay.
or potentially adding some sand into the mix to get you some bulk density there that might help with the blowing over problem. But, you know, just from experience, I don't care how heavy. We used to have one nursery in Pennsylvania that would put about a 1/2 inch of 3/8 inch pea gravel on the bottom of their pots to try and prevent blowing over. It didn't work. So, you know, I would say adding a little more compost might help you in the long run, just to, you know, kind of prevent that blowing over issue.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody else? All right, we'll move on. Tree fertilization. So again, after touring the nursery, I heard a few different things out there. As you all know, a balanced fertilizer is best for most applications. That means something that has nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash in it. It might also have some micronutrients as well. What I heard that out at the nursery is that we've used some Osmocote in the past. Last year we tried wood ash, which really doesn't have a whole lot of nutrients to it. But to get the best growth from our trees out there at the nursery, we really need to be applying fertilizer. There is not a plant in container anyway that comes to our nursery that doesn't have fertilizer in it. Bald and burlap, you don't see the fertilizer, but it's in there somewhere. But container plants, every single one has Osmocote on the top of the pot in some form. So I would highly recommend that you get into a regular regime of a spring or fall application, something that's going to help with growth out there. Because that was one thing I noticed. A lot of your trees are looking stunted out at the nursery, like they just need to be fed more. And I know if I was a homeowner and you came out and said, I want to plant a tree on your yard, I'm expecting a 2-inch caliper tree that's, 15 feet tall. And what's out, not to pick on you, but what's out there at the nursery is not that. And I think some people might be a little disappointed when the tree comes to their yard. So fertilizer is going to help with that. Now, we have soluble fertilizers, which means they're mixed with water. Think Miracle Grow. Not that I'm recommending that. They act really fast, but they are gone really quickly as well. Soluble fertilizers in general are not recommended for nursery growing because they're gone too fast. We want something slow release that is, you put a small amount, let's say on the top of the container, and it's going to release the nutrients over a set period of time. There's 5 or 6 month release. There's 8 or 9 month release. Well, we know our growing season here in New England, 5 or 6 months is probably just right for us here. We don't need that 8 or 9 month release that they might need in Florida or California, somewhere like that. So when you start shopping for these products, I would look for a 5 or 6 month release. There are different formulations of Osmocote as well. The one that's most recommended is an 18-5-12. So that's 18% nitrogen, 5% phosphorus, and 12% potash. It's a really popular blend. It can come in either 5 to 6 month or 8 to 9 month. I did a little research on it. But that nitrogen is really going to boost the growth on the plant material that you have out there and get things growing faster. What else do I have here? You definitely want to follow the label on the bags of these products because you can overdo it and burn things, and we don't want to do that. So they oftentimes will have like a grams per container size. So you're definitely going to want to do all your research on that. When you do your tree top dressing, we'll call it, because that's the name for it. Anytime the trees blow over, you're going to be losing fertilizer. So it's going to be all the more important to keep the trees upright and keep them from blowing over because you're going to lose nutrients. You also might have potential runoff issues, being that you're on an organic farm. The last thing you want to do is have these inorganic fertilizers start to build up and somebody say, hey, what's going on here? So overwatering can also cause a rapid release of osmocote. So the drip irrigation, you shouldn't have a problem with it, but if you're running the drip irrigation for 3 hours each time you run it, that might cause a rapid release. And these products all release due to moisture and temperature. So when it gets hot in the summertime and you're doing 3 hours of watering, you may find that osmocote is breaking down really quickly. So it's something to check into to make sure you're not losing nutrients too quickly. And they do recommend delaying application because you're dealing with young liners. They recommend delaying application of osmocote for 3 to 6 months after you plant out the liners. So the first year you're kind of off the hook. You don't have to apply anything. The compost should feed them as much as they need to be. But that second year, probably in April or at the very latest early May, you're going to want to get some fertilizer onto these trees.
Dan, you said fall or spring, but now I'm hearing you say spring is really the time to
Well, that
fertilize?
was with the newly planted trees.
Okay.
The established trees that you have out there now, you could do a fall application. It just won't release in the wintertime.
I see.
And provided they don't get knocked over in the wintertime or when you're moving them around, you don't tip them, that fertilizer will kick in and start working in the spring. Generally speaking, in the nursery, in the commercial nurseries, there's a little more time on your hands in the fall. It's not the busy shipping season. You're not planting things up. So a lot of times they do some of these jobs in the fall or maybe in the late summer just to get them out of the way at a time when they're not quite so busy. Any other nutrient questions? Wow, that's a quiet group. Everybody must be hungry. I might grab a drink of water quick. All right, we'll move on to weed control or weed suppression, depending on how you want to look at it. Again, in touring the nursery, I see different things than what I wrote down here. But weed control is critical for a lot of reasons. Not only looks, but also insect and disease suppression. A lot of insects are harbored within weeds, and they will just jump over to our nursery stock. And it might be a leaf hopper that feeds on the leaves. It could be aphids. There's any number of insects that can move from weeds to our growing area. So we definitely want to keep weeds under control. Diseases the same way. A lot of times plants that we consider weeds carry diseases that can be transferred to our nursery stock. And all it takes is an aphid to feed on that weed and then feed on our tree, and they will spread the disease from one place to the other. So it's really important to keep the weeds down. After I toured the nursery, I realized that you can't use any chemicals out there. That's unfortunate because there are a lot of good chemical controls on the market for controlling weeds. But you got to go with what the farm says. But a lot of these products are applied to the soil surface, and they'll keep the weeds under control for a season or more. But they can be very expensive and not cost-effective for you. There are not many good organic weed controls, unfortunately. Everybody talks about corn gluten. The effectiveness of that product is very limited. Maybe 10 to 20% control on weeds. So it's probably not even worth putting on. Hand pulling, since you have such a great team here, hand pulling as soon as possible when you see the weeds is going to help cut down on weed seed introduction. So if every time you go out to the nursery, everybody pulls a few weeds out of the containers, that's going to go a long way to controlling the weeds. Most of your weeds are going to come from contaminated liners, which dealing with bare root plants, theoretically you shouldn't have that problem. There's no soil there, so So you shouldn't have soil that's going to have weed seeds in it. Equipment, be it the wheelbarrow that you put the compost in, or if you use any tools for weeding, it's really important, and I know my cousins do this on their farm. They wash all their equipment when they go field to field. It wouldn't be a bad habit to get into to washing your weeding tools or any tools that you use out there, either prior to using them again or after you're done with them each time, just to rinse off any weed seeds that might be on them. This, again, shouldn't be a problem for you, but irrigation water can be a big source of weed seeds. Now, again, using my cousins as reference, they draw water from the Mill River in North Amherst. The weeds just float in the water, and they're sucked up by their irrigation system, and then they pull their hair out because they've got weeds in their fields. You don't have that problem because yours is coming from a well, so that's positive. However, the drip irrigation tubes themselves can have weed seeds on them. So maybe prior to putting them into the containers each spring, you either do like a bleach and water solution and wipe them down, or at least hose them off before you put them into the containers. Weed seeds are crafty little buggers. They'll hide anywhere and end up in your plant material.
Dan, sorry to interrupt, but just to clarify, you're talking about weeds right now in the pots,
Yep.
right? Okay.
Yeah, sources of the weeds that you're going to get in the pots. So another source is going to be the plants that are growing in between your containers. And we'll get to that more when we get to ground control, but that's where your primary source of weeds is coming from, as well as your potting mix. As I mentioned in the soil portion, you've got your compost pile sitting there on the ground, surrounded by weed sources, and without it being covered, it's just going to be a magnet for weed seeds. Everybody wants to grow in compost if they can, so you're starting out behind the 8 ball by having that pile sitting out there. This isn't really a problem for you, but vehicles can track weed seeds in, and then of course there's the wind. Weed seeds can blow quite a ways depending on the type of weed. As we all know, dandelions blow all over the place, and there are other weeds just like that will blow weed seeds quite a ways. So windborne seeds. And I talked about the fence line that you have out there, maybe putting some weed fabric 3 feet up or 4 feet up, depending on the width of the weed fabric, all the way around the fence line, might help prevent some of the weed seeds that are currently blowing into the containers and becoming a problem. Sanitation, again, is the key. Manage a weed-free area around the containers, and you're going to have fewer weeds in the containers. And like I say, pulling them as soon as you see them before they get to the seedling stage is going to help you in the long run quite a bit. Questions?
I'm new and I haven't seen the nursery, but I've been getting good description from you.
Yep.
And I've always wondered about this in general gardening, and what do you normally do with weeds once you grab them? Like, where do you put them? Like, what's the best thing to dispose of weeds?
Well, an enclosed compost bin would be a good way to go. That generally will heat up enough to kill the weed seeds, depending on how you treat your compost. An exposed pile isn't going to heat up as much. That's why I say in some kind of bin would be the best way. Short of that, getting them away from the nursery, because that's what we're talking about, or your garden, getting them somewhere as far away as possible, and putting them in a pile or disposing of them somewhere would be a good way to go. The farm, I would think, must have a compost pile somewhere that you could toss weeds into. Put them in a container of some type and take them to their compost pile.
Right now, the farm's compost is within, it's probably 100 feet away from our nursery, so they could be just blowing right back in.
Yeah, they could be.
Currently we're bringing them across the road and kind of tucking them back behind sort of a windrow, so I think they're in a pretty good place there.
Yep, that sounds like a good way to deal with them. Having a compost pile that close that's exposed to the same weed seeds that your nursery containers are is probably not the best. It's not like Martin's Farm where they're big piles that they're turning all the time and heating up to 110 or 120 degrees.
Well, when we set up the nursery, we had a weed fabric first, and then lots of bark mulch, right? Should we be just adding bark mulch in the spring to try to keep them down? I mean, somehow they came up through.
Well, that's our next topic, but yes and no. If you add more bark mulch, you're going to have more moisture around your containers, which could cause root rot problems. It would keep the weeds down, but they will just germinate on top of the new bark mulch. So I suggested to Mary and Richard when we were out there that you get in the habit of mowing more often, string trimming more often, whatever you do to keep those weeds as short as possible and prevent them, at least some of them, from going to seed at all. So it'll be a little more maintenance for you out there, along the fence line in particular, I noticed quite a few weeds, creating some type of 3 foot, 4 foot, whatever they'll let you do, buffer between the pigs and the farm of where you mow and keep the weeds down is going to help you in the long run to keep things out of the containers.
So in the containers, we, especially over winter, we have a bunch of wood chips there. Is it reasonable to keep wood chips on top of the soil to help with weed control, or is that going to be a problem somewhere along the line?
Well, again, as I just mentioned, you can put a fresh layer of chips down every spring, but you might run into root rot problems.
No, I'm talking about in the container.
Oh yeah, I think that's on my next page. So it is on my next page. You can apply mulch to the top of the containers. We talked about that when we were out there as a physical barrier to inhibit the weeds from germinating. Now you have the disc barriers out there. I know those are quite expensive and it's hard to find the ones that fit your containers. But you can use a loose fill material. You can use something like now, if you ever come into Sugarloaf or any other nursery, you're going to see this rice hulls. They have found that they are very good at keeping weeds down. And they're kind of a pain for us when we load them in people's cars. They tend to spill out all over their cars. But the nurseries are trying to be more organic, so they're using rice hulls in a lot of their containers. And it does seem to be effective. And it's less expensive in the long run than the cocoa discs that you're currently using. You can use, I know one nursery, Monrovia, is out in California near pecan country. They use pecan shells in their containers to keep weeds down. They're very sharp. They're no fun to unload because they cut your fingers, but they do work as a weed control. You can use cocoa hulls. Again, they're rather expensive, but they will keep weeds down. You could use something as simple as sawdust or wood chips to help keep the weeds down, or bark mulch.
Dan, do you think the sawdust, because it's finer, would it perhaps form a better barrier than a bark mulch, which is a little bit more coarse?
Well, there's trade-offs, I guess, in both instances. Sawdust, as we know, is fresh carbon. So the microorganisms are going to come up out of the soil in your pots and use your osmocote, again, to feed themselves so they can break down that carbon into an organic source. So that's the bad part of sawdust. I think you're right, it would keep the weeds down. And the finer the barrier we put, so that's why the rice hulls work, but like large chunks of wood chips are not going to be as effective at keeping weeds down as are smaller chips of wood.
I do think we have access to quite a variety over at Lamore Lumber, because he has piles from ancient times. So there's all different types of coarseness and everything that we could choose from.
Well, the one problem there is that because they've been sitting out exposed, you could be introducing weed seeds. So that's something to think about. In that case, almost fresh chips would be better than the older pile. So you're not introducing more weed problems than you're trying to control. But with the fresh wood chips, you've got to keep in mind those microorganisms and maybe feed a little bit heavier because of that. You've used the cocoa disc, but they also make discs out of geotextile fabric that might be cheaper and a little easier to deal with. So that might be worth looking into. They make them out of peat moss as well. It's a compressed peat moss, so they're not using as much peat, but they are effective in weed control. And then you could also, if you have some crafty people here, make them out of cardboard. We're all recycling cardboard every week from Amazon and everywhere else. You could cut out discs from the cardboard and use that. And lastly, you can use something as simple as crumpled up newspaper and use that. What we're trying to do is shade the soil surface to not give the weed seeds sunlight, which is what they need to germinate. So anything we can do to shade that soil surface is going to keep the weeds down. And then the depth of the material is going to dictate how effective it is. The deeper we put it, the more effective it's going to be at keeping the weeds down. So all things to think about. And that kind of leads into, on the ground around the containers. I know you have the landscape fabric down, but I think going forward, my best suggestion to you would be to put a fresh layer, level it off as best you can, and put a fresh layer of landscape fabric down with no chips on top of it, because the chips are giving the weeds a place to germinate. If you just have black landscape fabric there, you might get a few weeds germinating on top of it or where holes are in the fabric, but those will be easy to control. As soon as you add the chips, you've got a germination place for the weeds. So just straight black landscape fabric, and they make a real heavy one, like a 6 mil or even heavier, that you can put down. We have it in our greenhouse at the nursery. It has lines on it, which would help you lining up the plant material maybe. A lot of nurseries will space their containers according to the lines on the fabric. But that's what I would recommend going forward to help with the weed control. And if you're not ready or don't have the funds to do that, like I said, I think mowing is going to be your best bet out there. You could use some kind of a vinegar product, which would be organic, and at least burn the tops off the weeds. It's like 1 part vinegar to 5 parts water is what they usually recommend. There are commercial vinegar sprays on the market that you could buy pre-mixed and just add water to them. But that would at least burn the surface. You could also get what they call a flame weeder, which runs off of propane, and you could burn the weeds out that way. But those ones around the pots are where the problem is coming from. So it's really important that you get those under control around the containers, and that'll cut down on how much hand weeding you have to actually do in the containers.
So Dan, since we use bark mulch to mulch in the trees over winter, how would that work if we're putting down a fresh layer of the black landscape fabric? We would then bring in more chips to mulch in the trees, so then we're just introducing more chips on top of fabric again.
So when you go to line out the trees in the springtime into your set rows, you would just clean up those chips and add them to your chip pile for next year's potting or what have you. But you would take them away. You wouldn't leave them there. The fabric is the barrier to the weeds that are in the ground underneath your nursery. So if we put anything on top of that, wood chips, soil, even when the trees tip over and we spill soil, it's a good idea to clean that up, because all of that is a place for weeds to get started. And as we all know, once they get started, there's usually no stopping them. So the fewer spills or messes we make on top of that fabric, the more effective it's going to be at keeping the weeds down.
As far as the landscape fabric, is that how long does that last? Is that reusable? Is that a one-time thing, or is that going to be a couple of years, or do you have to? And then how do you dispose of it? And
so, in your situation out there at the nursery, you're not going to be in a high traffic situation. It's not like in our greenhouse in Sunderland where we're going in and out of the greenhouse, we're running wagons and carts over it on the same track every single time. So we're kind of wearing out the center part of our fabric already 2 years in, and we can see that, and we know we're going to have to address that. That's not going to happen for you because you're not having that kind of traffic. As far as length of time, because it's exposed to the sun, it's going to break down a little faster. But they generally, and they have different grades and different times, but you can get 6 or 8 years out of one piece of fabric. As far as disposal, it is a petroleum product in the long run. So, you'll have to get rid of it at some point. But if you can get 8 years out of it and then have to replace it, because you could probably buy a sheet that is wide enough to cover the whole nursery. They make them like up to 30 feet wide and 300 feet long. You could just buy one roll and somebody stores it in their garage or basement until you need to replace it and get, let's say, 24 years out of one roll, one 300-foot roll, because your nursery isn't that big. I forget the exact dimensions, but
so are there is there anything out on the market that's not plastic and useful as well?
So yes. Would it be useful for you? I don't know. We used to sell a paper landscape fabric at Hadley Garden Center. It was primarily used for vegetable gardens. The theory was that it would break down as the vegetables were growing throughout the season. In the meantime, it would keep weeds down and hold moisture in, and then you could till it in at the end of the season. The problem was that it broke down faster than they thought. So I don't think that would be viable. I didn't do a lot of research for you as far as what else is available on the market for organic weed control fabrics, but it might be worth looking. I don't know that there's much.
Dan, when you were out at the nursery with Richard and me, one of the things we talked about with trees blowing over, you said, well, we could keep them mulched in throughout the season. So then how would that work with the idea of keeping a clean landscape fabric surface?
Well, again, as soon as we bring those chips in to hold the trees up, which is a problem for us, we want to keep those trees upright so we don't lose the fertilizer, we don't get breakage, all those things. We're creating a place for the weeds to germinate. So my suggestion there would be, again, at the end of the season, when we go to bunch our trees together, we use new chips. When we bunch them together, get rid of those old chips. Get them out of there. Hopefully the weeds will not or minimally germinated in them during the season. And if we get them out of there, we've taken away the source of our weeds for the next year.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like it might be better for us to improve our current process, which was to, run a line from a post to the fence and then anchor the trees to that line to keep them upright and not introduce the chips at all, right?
From a weed standpoint, 100%. Yeah. I think a cable system that you can attach something to hold the trees upright is going to be the best way to go. And we're even thinking of that at the nursery right now for our container trees, because we get a lot of blowovers there. Everybody gets sick of standing up trees by the end of the season.
If we did something like that where we used cables, isn't there some part of what we're doing with the chips to keep the roots from exposure to extreme cold temperatures? Is there any danger of that?
Well, you're doing that for the winter months, and there is a danger in the winter. The roots are the most tender part of any plant, so by putting the chips around them during the winter, you're trying to prevent that exposure to the extreme cold. In the growing season, you don't have that issue, so you don't need the chips around them. The cable is just simply to hold them upright so that they don't tip over and break or spill fertilizer or soil media out of them throughout the season. And probably the drip tubes come out on occasion as well when they tip over. It's just preventing more maintenance for you folks to deal with.
I was wondering, you mentioned like a weed barrier around the fence, but is it possible to do a wind barrier around the fence? That would be like more a heavy duty windbreak kind of thing.
Well, I didn't hear in our little brief tour out at the nursery that other than the plants blowing over, the wind is a big problem. It's not like you're getting wind damage. There's not leaf tatter and that kind of thing going on the plants. You're getting blowovers. So I think the cable will help with the blowovers. You could put a wind barrier all the way around that fence, but that would mean you would have to move plants in from the fence. Otherwise, they wouldn't get enough sunlight. So that means you're losing growing area, and it's not a big growing area anyway. So I don't think you want to do that and compromise your small growing area anymore. I was thinking of the fabric maybe 3 or 4 feet up on the fence to prevent those weed seeds from blowing in from the fields you're unfortunately surrounded by.
I think what Richard and I have observed is, we haven't always been growing all of our own trees. We've been bringing trees in from nurseries, and they're in those plastic pots. And many times they're, sort of root bound and top heavy, and those are the ones that really were blowing over the most. So now as we're, moving toward really growing all of our own stuff in grow bags and maybe adjusting the mix so that it's a little heavier mix, hopefully we'll have less blowing over as well.
Right. And we had talked when we were out there, to go back to Mary's question about chips around the containers. We had talked about maybe putting chips around the containers to hold moisture, hold them upright in the wind. But Richard brought up the point that they would root into the chips because you're running into rooting out problems even now through the bottom of the container. And they would root into the chips as well and make removing them and taking them to your planting sites that much harder. So I think it's better to take the chips out of the equation and just use the weed fabric on the ground to help prevent weed growth. Anything else? I think that's all we had for session 1.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
We have more questions.
Just a question about spacing the trees. So most of our trees are maybe an inch caliper, 1.5 inches. How far apart should they be?
Well, it would probably all benefit you folks to go to a commercial growing operation and take a tour. It varies from nursery to nursery. But when they're doing these pot containers, which is what most nurseries are doing now, each pot is probably on a 4-foot center, maybe 5. They're trying to pack as many trees into an acre as they can. They want to maximize sunlight and growth potential, but they're also harvesting them, within 3 to 5 years of when they plant them in the container. So I think you can have yours a little closer. The grow bag itself gives you some spacing, but I would say 2 to 3 feet apart is plenty. I don't know what you're currently doing, but I don't think you need to space them much more than that. Again, you're not growing them up to 1.25 inches or 1.5 inches caliper before you're planting them out. There were a few that were maybe approaching 1 inch out there at the nursery, but those are probably due to be planted this year. Given the size of the container you're growing in, there's a limit to how big a tree you can grow there going forward. So I don't think you need to worry about spacing all that much. If you start to see dieback on the sides of certain species because they're too close together, that's when you got to rethink it and maybe space them out more.
This isn't anything that you were talking about, but just is in my head about the Mexican jumping worms, and I'm just wondering if there's other pests and problems that we might want to be thinking about or know more about.
Well, I don't think that's even on our list
it's in
of
it's
topics.
In my head.
Are they Mexican jumping worms or Chinese jumping worms? Mexico bad.
Oh.
China good nowadays. Just kidding. I don't know where they came from, but I think it was Asia. Yeah, they're a big problem. they eat organic matter like there's no tomorrow. Again, not to harp on your pile of compost out there, but it's sitting right out there. The jumping worms can come right into that pile, and all of a sudden you've got them in your nursery. I know we have them in Sunderland. I don't know if they came in some of our trees or they've come up out of the soil and gotten into our wood chips, but we definitely have them down there. We find them all the time. Unfortunately, I don't know what we can do about them. There's no real control for them. There's not a magic bean that we can throw in the soil and kind of kill them off. If we kill off the jumping worms, we're probably killing off our beneficial red wigglers and other worms that are beneficial to us. So I think we're going to just have to live with them and continue to add organic matter to the soil anytime we get a chance. I think it's going to be more of a problem in the forest because a lot of our native tree species are dependent on having a thick layer of organic matter around their root systems. Take hemlock and beech as two good examples. And if the jumping worms eat all that organic matter that's in the forest, there goes our hemlock and our beeches. They have other problems too that are probably going to do them in before the jumping worms do, but it's a sad state of affairs. As far as other pests there at the nursery, I mean, you're a little bit limited in what you can do because you're dealing with an organic farm all around you. There are horticultural oils that you could use if you have an outbreak. There are soaps, of course, that you could use. So there are good organic pest controls on that side of things. There's just not a lot of good organic weed controls. I think my best suggestion would be if you see a problem, prune it out first. Like if you see a branch with 300 aphids on it, prune it out. And then maybe you don't ever have to get to the point where you need to use a control product. If you have a species of plants that you always have problems with, you always get aphids on it, you always get, black spot on it, or rust, cedar apple rust, don't grow that one anymore. Pick a different species because you don't want to be planting that out on the street anyway. Lindens are notorious for getting aphids. So that's one thing I know about lindens. So it's a great tree. It grows fast. It makes a great street tree. It can take all kinds of conditions, but it gets aphids, and it's unfortunate. But they are prone to those.
Thank you.
So going back to weed control, when you said put down 3 feet of plastic around the perimeter, I was envisioning on the ground. But then in response to Ari's question, I got the idea maybe you were saying on the fence.
That's correct. I am saying on the fence, going 3 feet or 4 feet, whatever the width of the fabric is, all the way around the fence.
Got it.
To prevent blow-in of weed seeds from outside of your piece of property there. Because I think that's where a lot of your problems are coming from. You've got the pig farm behind you. You got the organic farm over this way. Who knows what we got over towards the camping area there. And then you got to cross the DPW lot. So your weed seeds are blowing in at this level. Yeah, there are some that are coming over the fence, but very few. They're coming in low down. So if we put that fabric up, hopefully that stops those weed seeds from blowing in and they drop on the outside of the fence. And then we keep it mowed out there so they can't get up above that fabric and blow in again.
Got it. Thanks.
Yep. I just saw the fence as an easy way to put that fabric around and maybe stop some of the weed issues.
Dan, I don't know if we're covering this question that I have, if we're covering it in another session. I was thinking about with the growing mediums, are we talking anything about actually planting techniques? Planting bare root techniques? Is that in another session? Or
I don't know if it was in any of the other sessions. I didn't bring my sheet with me. So just planting techniques. I mean, I don't know what you're currently doing. I guess you could fill me in, and then I'll work off of that.
Yeah, one question that I had. So currently, we're just trying to get them all at the same, have the same amount of growing medium in the pots and getting the root flares so they're at the same level. You know, we're trying for consistency. We're not there yet. But one thing that we noticed quite a bit is that a lot of the trees that we're getting in, the roots are huge to fit into those 15-gallon bags, and we're having to do quite a bit of pruning. And so I'm wondering if you have any suggestions about how to approach that pruning to be able to even get the structure of the root, you know, into the bag.
Sure. So let's start with the actual planting and getting the root flare where it needs to be and all that kind of stuff. You'll find in a garden center like ours that every nursery we buy from is different. Some are sticklers for doing the right thing, and others it's let's get it done as fast as we can. You know, we got 50,000 of these trees to plant, especially like with fruit trees. So it can vary quite a bit as to where the root flare is. So it's always a good idea if you buy a tree from us or anybody to find out where that root flare is, as you all probably know. So that's good. The other thing is if you're dealing with any grafted species, you want to make sure the graft ends up being above soil level as well. Crab apples, a lot of your maples, red maples in particular, are grafted nowadays. So you want to make sure that graft ends up being above soil level, which if you're getting the root flare where it needs to be, will be anyway. As far as pruning the root system, I just watched a little video from Bailey Nurseries out in Minnesota when I sent you that information. And they were going through pruning a tree before potting it up. And the thing they cut out without even worrying about it is coarse roots of all types. They'll cut those back hard. They won't touch the fibrous roots. So if you can bend them or manipulate them into your container, they don't touch them. But if you have those big coarse, let's say on an oak that has big coarse root system, they'll cut back those coarse roots very hard. Because those are really just support roots. They're not the uptake, the fertilizer and water uptake roots. So your tree is not going to miss them as much as they would those fibrous roots. You're hand potting everything, you know, have a crew there and one person shovels dirt into the bottom of the bag and then you put the tree in, get it set, and then you fill in around it. Do you pack it at all when you do it?
Yes,
okay.
Definitely.
And then water them immediately afterwards?
Yes.
So that would be a good time to have a bucket of Osmocote there in your potting process and just do the Osmocote right then, provided they don't tip over on the way to their final resting place. It might not be a bad thing to add in when you have a good crew of people there anyway. It would be easy enough to put a scoop of Osmocote on each tree as you're potting it up, and then that job is done for that year. Mm-hmm. Although they say wait 3 to 6 months. So
which do you think it is?
Well, I would check on the bag label.
Okay.
You're probably going to have to buy some anyway and just see what they say. You could always go online and look, but that's what I read in doing my research on Osmocote, that they said to wait 3 to 6 months before applying. So I'm sure different formulations, there might be different wait periods. Mm-hmm. So you might have one that's like a starter type formulation, and then that 18, 9, 12 or whatever I said there is more of a second year product. Anybody else? Well, I guess that's it for tonight.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank
This was
you.
awesome.
Thanks
Amazing.
for coming.